I got a comment recently from someone on Twitter where they said, "You're my favorite music writer with bad taste."
Well, hey, CNFers. I'm Brendan O'Mara, and this is CNF, the creative nonfiction podcast, where I talk to people about the art and craft of telling true stories, leaders in narrative journalism, essay, memoir, doc film, and even podcasting, so you can get a little bit better at what you do. Today's guest is Steven Hyden, but before we get to him, first a word from our flagship sponsors. Creative Nonfiction Podcast, the greatest podcast in the world, is sponsored by Goucher College's Master of Fine Arts in Nonfiction. Goucher MFA is a 2-year low residency program. Online classes let you learn from anywhere, while on-campus residencies allow you to hone your craft with accomplished mentors who have Pulitzer Prizes and best-selling books to their names. The program boasts a nationwide network of students, faculty, and alumni, which has published 140 books and counting. You'll get opportunities to meet literary agents and learn the ins and outs of the publishing journey. Visit goucher.edu/nonfiction to start your journey now. Take your writing to the next level and go from hopeful to published. And Goucher's MFA for creative nonfiction or just straight up nonfiction. CNF is also brought to you by Bay Path University. Discover your story with Bay Path University's fully online MFA in creative nonfiction writing. Recent graduate Christine Brooks recalls her experience with Bay Path's unbelievable. If it wouldn't be a Bay Path read if I didn't butcher it. I could edit this out, but I might as well leave it in because it's par for the course. Christine Brooks recalls her experience with Bay Path's MFA faculty as being filled with positive reinforcement and a commitment. They have a true passion and love for their work. It shines through with every comment, every edit, and every reading assignment. The instructors are available to answer questions, big and small, and it is obvious that their years of experience as writers and teachers have made a faculty that I doubt can be beat anywhere. Don't just take her word for it. Apply now at baypath.edu/MFA. Classes begin January 21st. Well. Look what the riff drug in. Yep, that's right. Welcome back, CNFers. CNF, of course, Creative Nonfiction Podcast, and today's guest is Steven Hyden. He's a music and culture critic, and most recently he produced the amazing narrative podcast Break Stuff about Woodstock 99. What was so great about hearing him say Woodstock 99 on this here show was hearing his voice. Like him, right there, saying it to me. I was like, that's the guy from the podcast saying Woodstock 99. Woodstock 99. He's got that great Midwestern accent, and it's just, it hit the notes. I was hearing it, it was resonating. It fell on my tympanic membrane with a kind and loving memory. He's also the author of Your Favorite Band Is Killing Me, Twilight of the Gods, and most recently, Hard to Handle, The Life and Death of Black Crows, of which he co-authored. I haven't read his books yet, full disclosure, so we don't talk about him here. His main intention of coming on the show is to talk about that podcast. That's why I reached out to him, because guess who played at Woodstock 99? Metallica. We didn't talk about Metallica, but anyway. But I'm gonna have him back on the show, and we're gonna talk about his books and his process behind those and what those meant. So, in any case, trying to simplify things, I believe it was this guy named Leonardo da Vinci who said simplicity is the ultimate sophistication. Trying to do this and not get fined for my day job, that's kind of what I'm up to these days. That's it. But I have to admit, I feel oddly disconnected. Like, if I'm not writing or querying or trying to generate features, then who the hell am I? Am I a fraud to talk to people who have the courage to write and publish while I'm doing this while I'm like this little bridge troll chewing on rocks and pretending like I know what I'm talking about and throwing rocks at people and just growling at them and drooling? I know on some fundamental level that's nonsense. But when you're not doing the thing and you're talking to people about doing the thing, sometimes I get a little jealous. Not envious, but like, oh man, What am I doing wrong? Am I that in my spare time I squeak the show out to celebrate the kind of work I wish I was doing? But it's fine. It's okay. Things will happen. In the meantime, the goal is to make a podcast worth sharing, of course. A show that makes you want to tell 10 of your friends, who will then hopefully tell 10 of their friends. And I'm no mathematician, but I think that's exponential growth. So keep the conversation going on Twitter at CNFPod, Instagram at CNFPod, and Facebook at CNF Podcast. You can search the Creative Nonfiction Podcast. You'll see it there. Like the page, you can engage. Like the page and engage. Hey. Ask questions, share the show. I'll jump in with digital hugs and fist bumps. Also, at this point, I also want to thank River Teeth, a nonfiction journal, for promotional support. Go check them out. Submit your work to them. Submit to their book prize. Anyway, so Steven Hyden is here, and he's a prolific writer for Uproxx. He wrote for Grantland for a time, and Break Stuff was his podcast that came out with The Ringer and Luminary Media. He's at Steven_Hyden on Twitter. I think you're going to love this conversation. In fact, I know you're going to love this conversation I had with Steven Hyden. So let's just get to it. Let's kick it. Here's me and Steve. You even contributed handwritten articles to your local paper. I think the first of which might have been U2's Zooropa, a review of it. So it was right in your blood from the beginning, wasn't it?
Yeah, it really was. There was a moment when I was around 12 or 13 where I made this calculation that I really liked music and I really liked to write. And it just seemed like the best possible life to figure out a way to combine those two things. And yeah, it was really something that I kind of pushed to do from a young age. I guess I was fortunate in that respect that like I knew exactly what I wanted to do.
And at that age, like, how did you know perhaps that was even a thing you could pursue?
I don't know. I mean, that's a good question because I didn't really know anyone that was in the media.
Mm-hmm.
I had no connection to that world. I mean, I was growing up in Wisconsin, pretty far removed from any major media centers, and obviously this was pre-internet. So, I mean, really the only exposure I had to criticism as a kid was like watching Siskel and Ebert, on television. I mean, I think those were the first two people I'd ever seen that, were professional critics. Like it was their job to watch movies and give their opinion about it. Like Roger Ebert was he was the first critic that I ever read. Like I went to the library and I checked out, volumes of the Roger Ebert Home Companion, and I would just read them cover to cover in my bedroom. And that's really how I learned how to write reviews, just reading Roger Ebert stuff. I was also reading like Rolling Stone and Spin magazine, stuff like that. It's so weird. Like my career is so kind of bizarre because I really had no idea what I was doing. Like I applied to one college. It was a state school that wasn't terribly distinguished,
Right.
But it was where, like when I was in high school, I wrote for my local newspaper, and my editor there had gone to the same state school. So I applied there because that's where he went, and I got accepted. And I was like, okay, well, that's it. I don't need to apply anywhere else. My first job out of college was working at the same daily newspaper that I worked at in high school, and I worked there for several years. Somehow I was able to kind of get out of that world and into like the internet world and the music criticism world. But it was just sort of like sheer force of will, I guess, that allowed me to do that.
Yeah, did you have anyone in particular that was granting you permission, or at least putting fuel in your tank, saying like, Steven, like this is great. We see your passion. You've got some talent. Let's nudge you in this direction.
Not really. I mean, I had a supportive editor at my first job, But, a lot of the things I was doing at that time were not, it wasn't anything that anyone really directed me to do or wanted me to do. I sort of made myself the music critic of like my hometown paper, even though there was really no demand for a music critic. And, I lived in this town that was like 2 hours from the major cities in Wisconsin, which are Milwaukee and Madison. If Guided by Voices was playing a show in Milwaukee, I would get an interview with Robert Pollard and I would write up a big story. I mean, no one at the paper really cared that I was doing this. No one really wanted me to do it. I just did it because I wanted to do it, and I could kind of talk my way into doing it. And at the same time I was doing that, I was also working on the weekend and covering tractor pulls, small town festivals like the Strawberry Festival in Waupaca, Wisconsin. Like I wrote about that like 3 or 4 times. But like these sort of music stories were things that I did, just sort of sneaking it in under the wire. I would say that for me, like the big inspiration at that time was Chuck Klosterman. Because he was the only person that I had seen who came from a similar background, from the middle of the country. He worked for daily newspapers. But he was eventually able to write a book, and then he got hired by Spin, and he entered into that sort of mainstream music criticism world, like the national media. And from what I could tell, like he had no connections to that. And I remember reading Chuck's stuff on the wire when he was still at the Akron Beacon Journal, like in the early 2000s, like right around the time that he wrote Fargo Rock City. It was the kind of stuff that I wanted to do. Like he was, I think he's about maybe 5 or 6 years older than I am. So he was like sort of like the upperclassman. He was like the high school senior, and I was like the freshman.
Right.
It was just hugely inspirational to me because it's so much different now because of social media that, it's easy to know who the big editors are. Like we all know who the editors are at the New York Times or the New Yorker or any of these sort of prestige publications that everyone wants to write for. But like in 2000 or 2001, it was a lot harder to know who these people were, especially if you were in the middle of the country. So to see someone from a similar background enter that world, it's sort of like if you're from Mars and you see a fellow Martian get to the planet Earth, you're like, wow, maybe I can get to the planet Earth,
Right.
And that's really how it felt. I have a love-hate relationship with social media, but as much as I hate it sometimes, I realize that I would not be able to be in this business without it. Someone who doesn't live in New York or Los Angeles and has never lived in those places. I lived for years in Wisconsin, and now I live in Minnesota. I wouldn't be able to do this job if it weren't for having a presence on Twitter.
Yeah.
I've met a lot of people that way, and I've gotten a lot of jobs like that. And now I'm fortunately in a position where I'm kind of well known enough where it doesn't really matter where I live. But for a long time, I needed that to get my name out there. I was very self-motivated for a very long time.
Would you say that self-motivation is kind of your superpower if you had one?
I guess. I mean, I think anyone who works in this business and has been around for a while, and, I'm at the point now where, I started my first job in the year 2000. And, I worked at a hometown paper. I worked at a hometown daily newspaper. I worked at an alt weekly. I've worked in websites. I've done podcasts. I've written books. I've kind of done like a little bit of everything. I think in order to do that, you really do have to be self-motivated. You do have to ultimately be able to exist without a whole lot of outside encouragement. Not that, I mean, obviously we all need encouragement. We all need someone to tell us that we're good at what we do, and that we need to be connected to some kind of community. As a writer, you really do need to be able to like look at yourself and say, I'm going to do this no matter what. Even if people don't like what I'm doing on this particular day, or even if I feel sort of discouraged, at this particular moment, I'm going to find a way to persevere. Because ultimately, if you decide to quit, like no one's going to care.
Yeah.
Like no one is going to care about your career as much as you do. And you can make some grand proclamation on your Facebook page. You can say, I have decided to leave the media business. I have decided to retire as a writer. And you may get some, nice comments on that particular day. You might get a lot of likes or retweets or whatever. But by the next day, people are going to forget and they're going to move on with their own lives. And you're going to be in your own life trying to figure out what you're going to do. I feel like I've always kind of had that. I've always had that knowledge that even if people are sort of supporting what you're doing in the moment, they're not going to be there forever. Like you are still going to be in your own sort of life, and you're the commander of your life. The validation that you need, but it has to come from within. And if you're looking for it to come, externally, you're eventually going to run out of fuel.
Yeah. I know through writing about writing about sports a lot, specifically horse racing and everything. Just kind of my niche in a lot of things. Writing about it and covering it often it kind of ruined it in a lot of ways for me. And I wonder if you experienced that with writing about music, because music's so important to you. I wonder if writing about it, some dampened your enthusiasm in any kind of way.
No, I don't think so. I mean, I'm at a point now, I've been writing about music in some professional capacity for, a couple decades now. And I can honestly say that, like, I like music more now than I ever have. I have gone through periods, though, where I experienced something similar to what you're describing. And I remember, like, when I was at Grantland, for that site, I was basically like the music columnist, where I was writing about. I mean, I had a lot of freedom to write about what I wanted to write about, but it was also understood that I was going to write about whatever the big release was that week. And I ended up writing about like a lot of pop music stuff. And I like writing about pop music stuff. It's an interesting thing to me. And I think I did a good job with it when I was at Grantland. But the thing I realized about it is that if I'm going to write about, say, a Katy Perry record, I can only do it as like a purely sort of intellectual exercise,
Hmm.
which might sound counterintuitive to say that about a Katy Perry record. But what I mean by that is that I don't feel personally a lot of passion about that. Like that's not an artist that sort of makes me excited as a music fan. But I can turn on the part of my brain that's a critic and engage myself into sort of looking at her career in a purely analytical way. And I can do that and I can write about it and I think I can do a good job with it. But the sort of passion of being a music fan is missing. And I feel like with a lot of that kind of writing that I've done in my career, like this sort of like pop music writing, it was going down that avenue. I think I'm happiest as a music critic when I'm just sort of allowed to follow my muse, when I'm allowed to like write about stuff that I just think is interesting or that I think is great. But it's something that I'm fully engaged with as a music fan. And I've just found that for me, like I'm happiest as a critic when the music fan in me is also being fed, and I think maybe that's where people get disillusioned when the music fan in them isn't being fed.
Hmm.
When writing about music or writing about film or in your case writing about sports becomes purely an analytical exercise and you're not engaged, like your heart isn't engaged, it's all about your head. And that's the thing I realized about myself is that if I'm just going to be sort of analyzing like the pop music sweepstakes, like
Hmm.
what's the latest trend, what's who's going to be the next big star, like what's the next big thing, like that sort of prognostication aspect of music writing, which I think needs to be there, and I understand why it is. Again, I've engaged in that, and I think I think it can be interesting, but ultimately, to me, it's emotionally empty.
Hmm.
Like I would much rather write about an artist who maybe isn't part of the pop music world, but I think is really great and is sort of under the radar. And like, I want to tell people about it in the same way that, like, if you and I were friends, I would say, hey, you got to check out this record. It's really great. You're going to really love it. And it doesn't matter if it's on the charts or if it's not, you know, the sort of zeitgeisty type phenomenon. It's just something that engages you, engages your heart.
Yeah, that's great. Like that's such a great point to underscore about just having at least a passion for the craft of the thing, even if like you're not thrilled about a particular record, it's still the process of being able to deconstruct it and try to tease out meaning and then write about it in an engaging way. It's like the same reason like John McPhee writes so well about geology or something. It's just like, oh yeah, I'll follow McPhee all the way down the geology rabbit hole because he's so fascinated with it. So it's like similarly, even though I might not listen to Taylor Swift, I know if I see a Steven Hyden byline on Taylor Swift's review, I'm like, well, I'm going to tune in for the review at least.
Yeah, and that's always like the best compliment that someone can pay if they say, I don't really care about what you're writing about, but the fact that you wrote it makes me interested in this topic. That's always like the best thing for me, because I always feel like like the pieces that do the best usually in terms of traffic are usually tied to topics that are already popular anyway. So I sometimes feel like it doesn't really matter if I wrote about this, because people would want to click on this, if anyone wrote about it. I got a comment recently from someone on Twitter where they said, "You're my favorite music writer with bad taste," which I thought was like sort of the ultimate Twitter comment to get. And I decided to take it as a compliment, because to me, what that means is I usually don't agree with you, but I still like to read what you have to say. That's like the best. That's the best thing that anyone could say to me, I think.
And there's a great line, speaking of your writing, that you wrote in after David Berman passed. It's towards the end of the piece you wrote, and it was just a sentence that you wrote that he said he often doubted his ability as a musician and a singer, and which was really touching, especially towards the end. And I would kind of maybe extend that to you. Are there any things that in your own writing and producing in terms of audio that maybe you doubt as as your own artist, that you doubt in yourself that you have to try to overcome?
Yeah, I mean, all kinds of things. I mean, the craziest thing about living like in an online world and dealing with people sometimes who don't like what you do, and them telling you that, is you tend to agree with the people who don't like what you do more than the people who do like what you do. Trolls have a way of articulating the very things that the critical voice in your head is saying, which is what makes that such a upsetting thing to read.
Because there's some
people,
truth to it.
Well, yeah,
sometimes.
or like or I don't know if it's true or if it's like, I mean, because I think that with anyone, with any writer, it really depends on the reader ultimately, and as far as like how well something is communicated. I mean, I think obviously as a writer, you take a lot of care and time in trying to articulate your thoughts and put it in the best possible way. But there's a relationship with the reader that needs to be there in order for a piece of writing to really come across. And there are readers who are warm and charitable, and readers who are very predisposed to not like what you do. The filter is very important, because I mean, I think about this when I write books, because to me, like a book, it's like taking a road trip with someone. You're the driver as the author, and the reader is in the shotgun seat. And you really need for that reader, to think that your stories are interesting, to think that the records that you're going to be playing on the radio are cool, and that they want to hear them, and they're going to want to, and you need them to think that wherever you're driving is a place that they want to go. And if they're on board with that, a book can really blossom and become this beautiful thing. If they're not on board with that, if they're like, hey, I don't like this first person that you're using, I don't like the subject matter, I don't like the way that you're choosing to use humor in this particular way, all of these sort of like aesthetic choices that you're making as a writer, if they're not on board with those things, it doesn't matter how well you execute them.
Yeah.
Like you're screwed. You're screwed. Like they're against you. I realized this from reading, Goodreads reviews, because Goodreads is notorious for having reader reviews from people who like read books on topics that they have no interest in. They're like,
yeah.
like I just wrote a book. Like I had a book that came out last year called Twilight of the Gods. It's about classic rock, and I got reviews on there they're like, I don't care about classic rock, and I read this book and it was really boring, and I don't like this isn't interesting. But it's like why would you read a book that you're not interested in?
And you're pulling down my rating too.
Well, that too, but it's like I'm kind of impressed that they would read a book from cover to cover that they have no interest in, and that they had no really chance of ever liking. And then they get to the end and they're like, okay, time to file the review. This book sucked. I wasn't interested in it at the start of it, and at the end of it, I still wasn't interested in it. And of course, I read that and I think, well, if I was a better writer, I could have made them interested in it. But the fact of the matter is that if the reader isn't going to be on board with you, it's just really hard to get to where you want to go. So it's tough, because I think every writer has the voice of like the reader in their head that is like least interested in what they're doing. The reader who says all your jokes aren't funny, everything you're interested in, like all the things you care about are stupid, and your thoughts on these things are stupid.
Like the Simpsons comic book guy is in your head.
Yeah, I think every writer has that voice in their head, and there are actually people like that in the world. There are actually people like that who are just not on your wavelength at all, and yet they've still decided to maybe check out something that you've done and tell you that they're not on your wavelength. You just have to you have to have the fortitude to say that I still want to do what I'm doing. And I think people who are like on my wavelength are responding to it. And hopefully, there's enough people on your wavelength that will help, that will enable you to be able to make a living at this.
Yeah.
But yeah, you really need those good readers on your side.
Now, of course, your primary vocation is a writer, and Break Stuff, of course, is a narrative podcast. So, as we start to unpack that a little bit, I wonder, like, maybe when you were conceiving of the idea, what was the thought process between choosing, say, to go the podcast route with it versus saying maybe a gigantic narrative feature in a online or in a magazine or a multi-part series like that. So how did you make that decision?
With Break Stuff, it really started with wanting to work in that particular medium, like a scripted podcast series. I was a huge fan of Slow Burn, the podcast that Leah Nathan did with Slate, and also You Must Remember This by Karina Longworth. Mm-hmm. Those were hugely inspirational to me. Inspirational in the sense that I just loved the shows. I thought they were really well done. If I follow their example, I think I could do my own version of this. So after that, it just became a matter of like trying to find the right subject, to do my version of that. And Woodstock 99 was just something I came upon, I think, fairly quickly. And I just had a really clear vision of it from the beginning. I was looking at the email that I sent to Sean Fennessy at The Ringer which was, I sent that at the end of August of 2018, so almost exactly a year ago. And, I outlined how I saw the show, and the outline that I sent was like pretty close to how the show ended up being. From there, I just ended up, doing a lot of reading about Woodstock 99, and eventually got in a position like where we started interviewing people, and it just came together. It just felt very natural to do it. And it ended up being a format that I really loved. To me, like podcasts, like these sort of documentary podcasts that are really becoming popular now, I think eventually they're going to sort of make oral histories obsolete, because
Yeah.
like whenever you read an oral history, they're so fun to read. But if you could actually hear those people talking, it just makes it so much better. And to me, like Woodstock 99, like the break stuff, I think that could have been an oral history, but it just made it so much more powerful to hear like John Scher, one of the promoters of the festival, like to hear his voice and to hear his like New Jersey accent, actually say the words that he was saying.
And that tinge of anger at being
Right.
blamed for so much of what went wrong.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And just the nuances that you get when you can actually hear people's voices. And, for me, it was also really nice because like I love documentaries, and similar to when I got involved in journalism, in the early 2000s, like I had no clue about how to get involved in sort of like national publications. Like now, like it's like I don't really have an entree into the world of documentaries, but I feel like after doing this show, like I kind of know the process. This wasn't a film. Like we didn't shoot any visuals, obviously, but like every other aspect of like documentary filmmaking and like how to script something like that. We did that with this show. So like I feel like I've got a much better understanding of that. It was just great. I mean, it was really scary at the beginning to do it. I kind of freaked out when I saw the schedule of like, because I had to write 8 scripts, and I was basically writing a script a week for about 2 months, and that was very intimidating. I feel like I wanted to push myself, in a medium that I hadn't really worked in before. At least not in this way. Like I'd been involved in podcasts, but doing like I started my own podcast in 2016. It was a show called Celebration Rock, but that was like a talk show essentially where I was interviewing a different guest every week.
Yeah.
And it wasn't, this was much more ambitious than that. So to me, it's like another storytelling medium. It's another way to talk about the things that I'm interested in.
What was the challenge for you, given that Woodstock 99 had so much coverage, books written about it, investigative journalism. So what was the challenge in trying to maybe unearth a new way of telling the story and maybe unearth some information that wasn't heard before? So your spin on it was definitely unique and new to the year.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like, one of the things that I felt made Woodstock 99 such a good topic for a show is that, much like Watergate with Slow Burn, it's a story that I think a lot of people know, like the sort of general outlines of it, but few people know like the specifics. Like you'd have to read a lot of Watergate books to be as well versed as Leon Neyfakh is when you listen to Slow Burn. And and I really found that to be the case with Woodstock 99. I mean, we kind of play on that a little bit in our first episode where we talk about the Limp Bizkit performance, because I think that is the sort of most iconic moment of that festival, and that's why I wanted to start with that. Because I think the common perception is that Limp Bizkit played this festival, they played the song Break Stuff, and then there was a huge riot and lots of fires, and the festival ended as this big catastrophe. When the reality is that Limp Bizkit played, some people in the audience got pretty crazy, but like it didn't end the festival at that moment. Like the riots that occurred at Woodstock 99 didn't happen until the next day. So that was sort of an interesting thing to talk about as far as the gap between the reality and the myth of the festival. And that just opened a portal to talk about so many other things, you know, whether it was the minutia of like how that festival was planned and like all the mistakes that were made along the way, to the sort of greater mythology of the Woodstock brand in general, and the idea of music festivals being this sort of, utopian, free, you know, area that you can just do whatever you want in. You can take a lot of drugs, you can like, you know, have free love, you can like listen to music, all these, fun things that we associate with the original Woodstock, and then connecting that to this festival that occurred 30 years later, where the ideology of the original Woodstock curdled in this sort of bizarre and violent and scary way. Um, that just seemed like a great way to talk about, baby boomers versus Generation X, and
Mm-hmm.
the sort of way that nostalgia distorts the past in order to turn it into a commodity, and how when that happens, it ends up replacing history. So we don't learn the lessons that we should from history. And it unfolds all these decades later into this disaster that ends up, causing so much harm. It just seemed like a great idea for a show, like something that seems so silly and frivolous on the surface, that is actually kind of like an epic story about America, I think, ultimately.
What ultimately surprised you the most about this deep dive you took over the last year?
Well, I had written about Woodstock 99 like several years ago. When I was at the AV Club, I wrote this 10-part series about 90s rock. It was called Whatever Happened to Alternative Nation. And it was almost like an excuse to write a book, but like on a website, like each installment was like 5,000 words. So this whole series was like 50,000 words. It's like a pretty
Wow.
large scale thing. And it's kind of crazy. It's like, that's the kind of thing that you could do on the internet like 10 years ago. Like, I don't think you could do that now. It's like there really is like a before and after social media. Because I really think of like social media becoming a big deal in the media in like 2010, 2011, around there. Like before that, I don't want to be another sort of bullshit mythologizing nostalgist here, but it does seem like things were simpler before that. Like I remember at the AV Club, we would post every story that we were going to run that day on our website at midnight, and the site wouldn't change all day. It'd just be the same stories all day long. It was basically like a newspaper cover, that whole idea. And you could do that, and people would come to your site and they would read everything on the site. Even like if you had loyal readers, they would do that. Like loyal readers of a newspaper would. Like they'll read it cover to cover because this is the thing that we read every day. So that series really kind of came out of that era, and really came at the end of that era. And anyway, I wrote about Woodstock 99 for that. And in that piece, I was very, like, the condemnation was of like Limp Bizkit and Korn and nu metal in general. It was very critical of the bands. And it took the tack that like became like a pretty common tact in the media, which was looking at those bands as sort of like examples of like cultural decay.
Hmm.
That like these bands, like I think my thesis of my piece was that like Limp Bizkit was sort of setting up the Bush administration of the 2000s. This sort of like macho, very sort of, aggressive man's man type music that was ultimately insensitive to, women and minorities and all this. That was the thesis of my piece. And I read that now and I think I was like pretty unfair to those bands. Actually, I think I was like, I don't think that was right to lay on them. And if you listen to Break Stuff, I take a much different position on that, where it's not about blaming the bands. It's really about, one, talking about the organizers, just all the mistakes that they made, in planning that festival, and also, the politicians that were, pushing that festival, like in the Rome, New York area, and also, again, talking about just the momentum of the Woodstock brand in general, and how that was created over the course of several decades. About how there was a festival that occurred in 1969 that had a lot of problems, but a movie came out the next year that sort of transformed this problematic festival into this generation defining event. And it created this phenomenon that people tried to recreate not once but twice in the 1990s. In 99, obviously a disaster. And I think just exploring that was maybe not a surprise, but I think I was just able to make a much more nuanced look at this, than I was when I wrote about it several years earlier. That it could be a portrait of something, because I feel like ultimately, like Break Stuff, it's not about like blaming any one person in particular, because I think there's a lot of blame to go around. I think everyone that was involved in that festival contributed to it becoming the disaster that it was, whether it's the promoters, whether it's the the media in some respect, whether it's the people that actually attended, who chose to act in violent and brutish ways. Just trying to avoid like easy answers, like the pat answer, whether it's like, oh, it's new metal's fault, or it's Generation X's fault, or whatever. Just trying to avoid that sort of pat, reductive sort of answer, and looking at it more broadly. And also, like in the last episode, to me, it was really important to talk about how the weirdness of that festival isn't just true of Woodstock 99, that you could apply to other festivals. Like if you go to Coachella, for instance, you're not going to see shirtless guys assaulting women necessarily, although there is still a lot of sexual harassment and assault that occurs at music festivals, not just Coachella, but, everywhere. But the sort of power dynamics that were in play at Woodstock 99, they're not as overt now. But if you go to Coachella, for instance, it's like about the power of status now. That like at Woodstock 99, there were these men that were sort of asserting their power over women, or there was generational power. This idea that like baby boomers can kind of force Woodstock to still be relevant, even in the age of Generation X. Or at the end of the festival, there's the power of the herd. Like the herd decides that they want to riot, and they end up sort of overwhelming everything and setting fires. And you don't see that at Coachella, but you do see people, with their VIP badges and living in like air-conditioned teepees, eating like this great food, and taking great pictures of themselves, and like having an experience at the festival that the average person is not going to get, but like we're all going to see. We're all going to see the people who are backstage and living the life that we all wish that we could live. And that's like another form of domination. It's like it's not as overtly scary, but I think it's as, in its own way, it's as alienating as the power dynamics that existed at Woodstock 99.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of like the Capitol in the Hunger Games. How that decadence is its own form of dominance.
Exactly. Yeah, and to me that's what makes this story bigger than just a music festival. I think it is about human nature. That idea that like we're always going to want to separate ourselves in some way, and why is that? Why is it that we feel that some people are going to feel the need to assert their dominance over other people? And why does it play out in this environment that is supposed to be this fun experience about enjoying music, but it ends up kind of creating this own society that has its own rules, but sort of replicates the rules of the larger society. It's a very, I mean, we use the term social experiment in the show, like about Woodstock '99, but I think all festivals, in a way, become social experiments.
Yeah.
About about why people are the way they are.
Yeah, and to that point, that was something I wanted to bring up was the gentleman you spoke to in the final episode about if you had an unethical scientist basically who ran an experiment, it would probably look like Woodstock '99 in the sense that there would be no water, there would be heat, which would breed frustration, and in the overlapping area in those three is basically the powder keg of Woodstock '99.
Yeah, and he was an interesting guy. You're talking about Dr. Leonard Newman, who was this psychology professor from Syracuse University, and we interviewed him towards the end of the show, or the end of our production. And the process of reporting for this podcast, it definitely made me more cynical about music festivals, and just about crowds in general, and the whole sort of mob mentality idea that if you get a bunch of people in one space, that inevitably they're going to default to some sort of like negative or aggressive behavior. And Dr. Newman was really great because he pushed back on that, and he talked about that. He didn't like the term mob mentality either. He thought that was sort of inherently like a negative way of talking about crowd psychology. He liked the term herd mentality, and he was talking about the idea that like when people are in groups, they tend to act differently than they would be if they were just individuals, because when you're in a group, obviously you feel less culpability or less responsibility for your own actions, and that can obviously result in negative behavior. But he's saying like that can also result in positive behavior. Like there's examples of people being more heroic or more brave than they would be normally because they're in a group. It's really about sort of the other circumstances in the environment that ultimately points people in either the positive or the negative direction. And that's why he said the thing that you talked about, how if you were going to create a situation where people were going to go to the dark side, that you would generate a scenario like Woodstock '99, because it just seemed engineered to make the group act in a bad way.
A part of me was thinking like it was going to be some sort of I don't know, like talking more to like the main headliner act, kind of almost as ignorant and stupid as this might sound, kind of like a recap from the of the bands that were there and maybe some of the band's point of view. And it was so great and refreshing that you were able to take the dive you took and to tell such a bigger story and examine it with nuance and everything you did. So it was what a delightful surprise, and I'm so happy you made this work, and I have to thank you and applaud you for it.
Well, thank you so much. That's really nice of you to say. I mean, I feel like what you're talking about, where that approach where you're basically just talking about the performances on stage and like how crazy they are, and how in many cases they're very schlocky and sort of unintentionally hilarious.
Right.
Like that's sort of the common way to talk about Woodstock '99. To like laugh at the bands basically on stage, and I didn't really want to do that because number one, I think that's a very easy thing to do. It's very easy to always, look 20 years in the past and look at the things that used to be popular and to point out all the sort of, anachronistic things about them. Like people are going to do that about 2019 and 2039, like in ways that we don't really realize. But there's tons of things about our culture now that are probably hilarious that we don't notice yet. To me, it was more interesting to look at that time and to make it relevant to now, to not look at what was different, but to look at what's common. And there's a lot of things about it that are very specific to 1999, but there's also a lot of things about it that I think are pretty universal. And I think that's ultimately like the most powerful parts of the story.
Great, right? Steven Hyden, good dude, great dude, a great dude. Go check out his work. So I need to give out a recommendation again. Since I recorded this before, that was a thing. I couldn't ask Steve to recommend anything. So here it is. I'm going to do this again for a second consecutive week. My recommendation is the Blackwing Long Point Pencil Sharpener. Sharpens your pencils, easy peasy. It's nice and small. I've been using a single pencil for several months now in my journal. I've been counting the words in that pencil, and it's up to 94,000 words. I'm hoping to get to 100,000. It's cutting it very close. It's kind of painful to write with now, but we're getting there. When I sharpen the pencil, I use the Blackwing Long Point Sharpener. Okay, thanks to Goucher's MFA in Nonfiction, Bay Path University's MFA in Creative Nonfiction, and of course River Teeth for the support. If you think this podcast is worth sharing, try and get your pals to subscribe and keep that conversation going on the internet. Let this episode kickstart a dialogue that carries us through our work week into the next week. Why not, right? We're here to support each other. It's at CNF Pod on almost all the socials. Head over to BrendanO'Mara.com, for show notes and to sign up for the second best newsletter in the world. Once a month, no spam. You can't beat it, so far as I can tell. That's got to be it, right? Hey, you know what? If you can't do, interview. See ya!